Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is Yevamot daf Zion. And although we got yesterday with Ellie a little bit further, I'm going to back up just a little bit. But I also want to just provide a reminder of the framework of what's going on, because we're in the middle of an extended discussion, and sometimes it pays to just take a moment and remember where we are, what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve in the Gemara, so that we don't get lost, especially as we have breaks between days. Sometimes, most of the time, you can look at one little piece of Gemara and everything is fine, and you got it all clear. But we're in the middle of a very long discussion, and so let's back up and begin and remember the two questions that were asked way back at the bottom. Of course, we're now at the bottom of Daf. We're going to start at the bottom of Daf Vav Amud 6b, and we asked these questions back on Daf Gimel Amud Bet, and the questions were: do we say, we have this concept of Aseh Docha Lo Taseh, that when you have a positive commandment, it overrides a negative commandment, and so even though the Torah says you shouldn't do something, since the only way to accomplish a positive commandment is to do that thing, so as a result, we're going to say that the positive commandment overrides the negative commandment, and therefore you should go ahead and do the positive commandment. Now, the questions that we asked back on Gimel Amud Bet were: one, do we say that for all negative commandments, or just your typical negative commandment? In particular, do we say it for a negative commandment that's punishable with kares, for example, to marry a brother's wife, or more specifically, to marry your wife's sister? So, and then the second question is: how do we know that we say Aseh Docha Lo Taseh even for a regular negative commandment? So we answered the second of those questions. We determined that everyone derives the concept of Aseh Docha Lo Taseh from the juxtaposition of the prohibition of shatnez, that's wearing wool and linen in a mixed garment, and the positive commandment of tzitzis. And so, because the tzitzis are supposed to be wool, or can be wool, at least that's a simple understanding of tchelos, is that it's wool, and the beged itself can be linen, and so as a result, you're able to mix wool and linen in tzitzis. And so, even though in general we advise not to do it if you don't have to do it, but you can do it. And so the bottom line is that we say Aseh Docha Lo Taseh, a positive commandment will override a negative commandment. Now, so that's the answer to the second question, but we still have the answer to answer the first question. Now, why do we need the answer to the first question? Why do we care whether or not a negative commandment that is punishable by kares also has the principle of Aseh Docha Lo Taseh? Well, the reason that we asked that question is that we used a Gzeira Shava to explain why the principle of Yibum does not apply to every wife of someone's brother. So again, using our classic example of Ruvain and Levi. So Ruvain's brother Levi marries, we'll call her Dina, and Levi marries Dina, and now unfortunately Levi passes away without any children, and so now Dina is going to can do a yibum with Ruvain. That's the ordinary situation. Now, we noted that if Dina now ordinarily, if Levi had children, Ruvain would not be allowed to marry Dina, but because it's the wife of a brother, but the specific mitzvah allows us to do that. Now, one might have thought, we said, that you might apply that permission to any kind of situation. And we said, no, that, as we saw in our initial Mishnah in Maseches Yevamos, that there are 15 kinds of relationships where that can't happen, where you're not allowed to marry Dinah. So, and of course, the first example and the easiest one to give as an example is if Dinah is Reuven's daughter. If Dinah is Reuven's daughter, then Reuven can't marry Dinah. And so the question is if so the reason now that we want to try and say that we would ordinarily say ase docha lo taseh even by something that has a race is because if we don't say it, or let's then and we don't say it in a broader sense, well, then why did we need this Gzeira Shava of Aleha? The Gzeira Shava of Aleha told us that for the 15 relationships in our Mishnah, that Reuven is not allowed to marry Dinah, even though there's a specific positive commandment to perform Yibum or Chalitza. And so as a result, we said that in those 15 situations, that you don't have to do anything. There's no requirement. God bless you. There's no requirement for Yibum or Chalitza. And so the only way that Gzeira Shava makes sense is if we might have said that because of Ase Docha Lo Taseh, we would allow somebody to marry his daughter, his wife's sister, etc. One of those 15 relationships that we mentioned in our Mishnah. And of course, the paradigmatic one is the wife's sister. That's the one where it actually uses the word aleha in it. And we learn from the wife's sister to every other situation. So the point is if we can show that, or what we're trying to show is that Ase Docha Lo Taseh applies to even kares situations, and so that would be why you would need to have the Gzeira Shava of Aleha. Now, where are we in this process? Well, we have already rejected two possible explanations, two possible sources for why we might say Ase Docha Lo Taseh. One involving Kibud Av V'Em and Shabbos, and the other involving the construction of the Beit HaMikdash. So we've already eliminated two possibilities, and now we're in the middle of the third possibility of why one might have thought that the positive commandment would override the negative commandment. Specifically, we're now referring to the commandment not to kindle fire on Shabbos. And we cited a brisa that says that one might have thought that the positive commandment would override the negative commandment. And what's the positive commandment? The positive commandment that's going to override kindling on Shabbos is the commandment that if there's somebody that is obligated for the death penalty, we should put them to death. And we might have thought that we would put them to death even on Shabbos. And so the Gemara cites a specific Gzeira Shava that tells us that we do not, in fact, kill somebody even on Shabbos. So why does that matter? Because the fact that we need a Gzeira Shava to tell us that we don't kill somebody on Shabbos with hot lead tells us that if we didn't have the Gzeira Shava, then we would say that the positive mitzvah of killing a murderer or killing somebody who violated some sin would sin that is chayav misa would override the prohibition of lighting of kindling on Shabbos. And so as a result, that shows that there's a general principle that the positive commandment overrides a negative commandment even when death is on the line. And so as a result, now we've explained why Aleha makes sense, right? It makes sense because if we didn't have Aleha, we would think that the positive commandment of Yibum would override the negative commandment of having improper illicit relations. So now we're going to undermine that idea. And we're going to say that the reason that we might have otherwise thought that we could kill somebody who was chayav misa from Beis Din, with a reason that we might have thought that is not because of the principle of aseh docha lo taseh, but because of a different principle. And so as a result, you cannot learn the principle of aseh docha lo taseh regarding a kares prohibition from the fact that we say that you can that a gzeira shava is necessary to prohibit the killing of somebody who is chayav misa. And therefore, we once again have our question of why do we need the gzeira shava of aleha? So we're at the bottom, the third to last line, Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi, the second word on the line. And so that's where we're picking up. So again, we've gone around and around. We're trying to show why we need a gzeira shava of aleha in connection with yibum, to tell you that you cannot do yibum with your daughter, your wife's sister, etc. And yet we have not yet shown that there's a reason to think that you could do it. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to show, why would you think that you could do that, have that kind of relationship? After all, there's a negative prohibition in the Torah here. All right, so now we have Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi. Rav Shimi bar Ashi says, "Hi Tana," that the Tana that we saw from Rabbi Yishmael, who interpreted the verse as teaching about the execution of a capital offender, that does not override Shabbos. Lo mishum de aseh the dochi lo taseh. It is not, in fact, because a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. That is not the reason that we might have thought that we would be allowed to kill somebody who is chayav misa Beis Din to on Shabbos. Ela mishum demaisi kal v'chomer. Rather, the reason that we might have thought that you could kill somebody who is chayav misa on Shabbos is because of a kal v'chomer. So what's the kal v'chomer? So we're going to tell you. V'hachi kamar. And this is what the Tana is saying. How do I fulfill how do I apply that the obligation that somebody who profanes Shabbos is going to be put to death? When it comes to other kinds of things other than killing via Beis Din, that would be okay. That would be not okay on Shabbos. About Mises Beis Din, Dochya Shabbos Mikal v'chomer. But the killing of somebody who violates Shabbos, the killing of somebody who is chayav misa would override Shabbos based on the following kal v'chomer. And now we begin the kal v'chomer on the top of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Uma avoda. When it comes to the service in the temple and the Beis Hamikdash, shehi chamura v'docha Shabbos, we know that in the temple service in the Beis Hamikdash, you would violate Shabbos on a regular basis because you're not allowed to kill an animal on Shabbos, and yet they would sacrifice animals even on Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash. And yet, ritzicha dochosa, and nonetheless, when it comes to murder, we would override that. And as Rashi says, top line in Rashi, She'im haya rotseach kohen, if you have a murderer who is a kohen, the rotzela avod avoda, and he wants to do the avoda in the Beit Hamikdash, well, Beit Din sholchin umevian oto lamut. If he's a murderer and has already been convicted, he needs to be taken away, even from doing the service. So Ela im kain haya al gago shel mizbeach. The only exception is that he's already on the roof of the mizbeach, putting the animal down. The avodah biyado, and the service is in his hand. That's the only exception. So the point is, and Tosfos says the following: if you take a look in the second Tosfos on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, Shenamar me'im mizbechi va'afilu im ein sham kohen acher. He points out that even if there's no other kohen, roy la'avoda sha'avoda nidches, even though this might mean that the avoda gets postponed and gets pushed off, and we don't actually do the avoda, that's the way the world works, because we believe that murder and avoiding and punishing somebody who has committed murder is more important than the service in the Beit HaMikdash. Shenamar, as we said, me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamut, right? Right? You were going to take somebody even from next to the altar in order to kill the person. Shabbat shenidchas mipnei avoda. So now that we see that the avoda, which is so let's rank them, right? So we have avoda is more important than Shabbos, and we have murder is more important than avoda. So that eno din shetehei ritzicha docha osa. So then, when you have Shabbos, that is less important than avoda. Then certainly murder should be more important than Shabbos, and we should be able to kill someone who is chayav misa on Shabbos, even though it might involve a violation of Shabbos. And so that is the basis. That's the reason that we might have thought that somebody could get killed. And that's the reason that we need the Gzeira Shava of Moshvo Seichem, that we need Moshvo Seichem to tell us that do not say that Kal V'chomer. So the Gemara now, so where are we? So at the moment, we've disproven you can no longer use this teaching, this brisa, to suggest that that's why we need the word aleha. So rather, we still don't have a basis to need the word aleha. Now, why did the Gemara think that our Mishnah, there was some wording in the brisa that we cited on Daf Vav Amabet, and the question that the Gemara is going to very briefly now turn to is how did that work? How did we want to read the brisa itself? I'm sorry. First of all, how did we want to read the brisa with respect to this understanding? And then we're going to read the brisa with respect to the prior understanding, with respect to this understanding, meaning that it's a kal v'chomer, and then we'll turn to if it were asay docha lo tasay. So umay o enu dekamer, in the brisa that we cited on Daf Vav Amabet, it said, maybe not so. It went back and forth. First it said maybe this, and then it said maybe that, and then it went back to maybe this, and then it went back to maybe that. Usually you don't have that back and forth in a brisa. And so the Gemara is now going to explain what was the logic, what was the Tana thinking when he went back and forth. So Hachikamar, this is what he was trying to say. Kvuras meis mitzvah tochiach. Maybe you might say that the burying of a meis mitzvah shows that our kal v'chomer is not correct. How? Shedocha as ha'avoda ve'ena docha as Shabbos. Because I would think that meis mitzvah would docha the avoda, meaning that if the Kohen who is going to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, the only one happens to come across a dead body on his way to the Beis HaMikdash, and there's nobody else to take care of that dead body, well, then he needs to engage in taking care of that dead body, and he is not allowed to go to the Beit HaMikdash to perform the avoda. But the ein docha as a Shabbos, but we say it does not docha Shabbos. So therefore, we've shown that the kal v'chomer that we want to make is not necessarily a good kal v'chomer. But then Hadar Amar, but then the Tana revisited the question and considered the following: maybe Kvuras meis mitzvah tidka Shabbos. Maybe in fact, actually, my supposition to undermine my kal v'chomer actually supports my kal v'chomer, and we say mikal v'chomer, and that in fact burial of the dead when there's nobody else there would also override Shabbos because of the same kal v'chomer. Ma havoda shehi docha Shabbos kvura meis mitzvah docha osa. The fact that we have avoda, which is more important or overrides Shabbos, yet we say that the kvura of a dead body who doesn't have anybody to take care of it is also docha the avoda. So again, we end up with kavura meis mitzvah. We have meis mitzvah over avoda over Shabbos. So the fact that we've got meis mitzvah over Shabbos suggests that maybe it's docha Shabbos too. Mivla achoso, right? From the fact, and we learn the fact that it is docha the avoda from the fact that it says or to his sister. That's in connection with with a nazir who is forbidden to contaminate himself with respect to tuma. So the point is that the fact that it says a general prohibition and then it gives the details, so it shows Shabbos shenircha mipnei avoda, right? I'm sorry. That shows that the burial of an abandoned corpse overrides the avoda. So now Shabbos shenircha mipnei avoda. When it comes to Shabbos, which is in and of itself overridden by the avoda. So again, we show avoda is greater than Shabbos, and we've got meis mitzvah is greater than avoda. So eino din should tehei kvuras meis mitzvah dochosa. Well, then certainly meis mitzvah should override Shabbos. So Talmud Lomar lo siva'aru. So that's why the Torah needed to say lo siva'aru b'chol moshvosechem, right? The moshvosechem, which connects is a gzeira shava between lo siva'aru and the other case, tells us that the case of killing somebody who's chayav misas based in, tells us that Shabbos does not in fact get overridden by when you have to kill somebody through based in. And so again, that tells us, and now again, this was all through a kal v'chomer and not through aseh docha lo taseh. So we're left with the question of why do we need the aleha gzeira shava? So now again, the Gemara is going to say, okay, you've explained how in the end we're going to understand this brisa, but how do we understand this back and forth in the brisa in the first place when we thought it was aseh docha lo taseh? So ulamai desalek adaita mikara de aseh docha lo taseh my oeno de kamar. When we originally thought that the reason that we were going to allow the execution to override Shabbos was because of the concept of aseh docha lo taseh. Why? What was our thinking what was the understanding of this brisa when it said, or maybe not so? So hachikamar, this is what the brisa was thinking. How is it that I am going to fulfill this concept of mos yumas, that somebody who profanes the Shabbos should be put to death? The shar malachos chutz mimisas based in. That it's when it refers to other kinds of things other than execution. Meaning that's what we won't do on Shabbos. But aval misas based in. But when it comes to misas based in, dachi Shabbos. That we would say that does violate Shabbos, and meaning we will violate Shabbos in order to do it because it's more important, or because it's an asi ase v'doka lo taseh, because we have an affirmative positive commandment to kill somebody who is chayav misa, and therefore that would be docha the lo taseh of Shabbos. So hadar amar, but then we thought. Maybe when do we say the concept of aseh docha lo taseh? That's only lo taseh greda. That's only when it's an ordinary prohibition, but not with a prohibition of chayav kares. Lo taseh sheyesh bo kares mishamat le dedachi. How do I know that with respect to something that's punishable with kares, you would have aseh docha lo taseh? And Hadar Amar, then the Brisa comes back and says, you know what? No, maybe we do say that. Atu aseh docha lo taseh, lav lo taseh chamor miminai, right? Doesn't in general, when we say an aseh is docha lo taseh, isn't that true when even a regular lo taseh has some aspect that is more chamor? And Rashi explains. It's opposite the Gilyon Hashas in my edition. Lav lo taseh chamer minei shahare lokin alav, because you're punished. Meaning, if you violate a negative commandment, you get malchus, you get lashes. But when you violate a positive commandment, in general, you do not get punished. And so that shows that a negative commandment is more severe than a positive commandment. And so and yet we say and yet we say that a positive commandment will come and override it. So Maili Chumra Zuta, Maili Chumra Rabba. What does it make a difference whether it's a small degree of chumira that it's a little bit more machmir or a lot more machmir? So it doesn't make a difference. So the bottom line is that maybe we would say ase doka lo tase even by a kares. So Talmud Lomar lo sivaru, and so that's why it needs to say lo sivaru. So that was our havamina, but the bottom line is we rejected that. In the end, we say that the reason that we say that the Torah needed to tell us that Moshe had to have a gzeira shava of Moshe Seichem between Mises Beis Din and Lo Sivaru Eish is because we don't engage even in Mises Beis Din on Shabbos. And so, and the reason that we might have thought that is not because of Asidoka Lotase by Kares, but rather because of a Kal V'chomer. And so as a result, we still don't have a basis to say Asidoka Lotase by Kares, and therefore we don't have a good reason why we need the Gzeira Shava of Aleha with respect to Yibum, to tell us that Yibum does not apply when there's a relationship between the brother, who is the surviving brother, and the widow of the brother who has died. And so we're still trying to figure that out. So Ella Itzterich, so rather, let's say the following. What it might have thought, and this is really, like I said, the fourth effort to try and figure it out. So now we're going to we're going to change our approach. Rather than seeking evidence of Aseh Doka Lo Taseh for something that's punishable with kares elsewhere, the Gemara is going to now suggest that there's a reason to think that specifically by Yibum, we might allow Yibum to override Arayos. Specifically, maybe just as we allow the overriding of the prohibition of marrying a brother's former wife, we override other Arayos. Specifically, we use the principle that when something is part of a general category, namely the category of the fact that the prohibition of marrying a brother's wife is part of the larger category of arayot, and we single out to teach a new law with respect to that category, with that respect to that specific item from the category, namely Yibum overrides the prohibition of marrying a brother's wife. So maybe the law, namely the law that we're going to allow the marrying of a brother's wife, applies to the general category and not just to the individual item. So as a result, maybe Yibum should override all arayot. And that would enable us to, again, need the Aleha Gzeira Shava. So let's take a look at it inside. So Ella, Itzra Sakal Kamina to have a high Ashes Ach, right? When it comes to the marrying of a brother's wife, so Davar Shahaya Bichlal, that is part of the category of Arayot. The Yatsa min Haklal Lamed, and yet it was singled out to teach us a special law, namely that we don't have the prohibition in order to allow Yibum, right? Because again, in an ordinary case, one is not allowed to marry the widow of one's brother, but you're allowed to marry the widow of one's brother in the case of Yibum. Lo Lamed al Atzmo Yatsa. So now that we've learned it out, don't tell us that it's only teaching about that specific law. Rather, it's teaching about the entire category of arayot, meaning that all arayot get lifted in order to perform Yibum. Titania, and so now we're going to give us the classic example of a klal, a davar shahaya b'klal, the yatsa min a klal lamed, lo lamed al atzmo yatsa, el lamed al klal kul yatsa. This is, of course, one of the 13 principles of learning, which we read in the morning just before we begin Psuke de Zimra. So Titania, davar shahaya b'klal v'yatsa min a klal hulu ketzad. What's an example of that? V'hanefesh asher tochal basar mizebach hashalamim v'tumaso alav. Right? So the Torah says that if you have somebody who is tameh and he eats from a shlamim offering, yet shlamim is a specific example. The fact that we specifically mention one example of the kinds of kodshim that exist, that suggests that we're taking one item out of the category. V'lama yatsu. Why was this specific item singled out. It was in order to connect the following idea and to tell you, just as when we say shlamim are specific, are things that go on the altar, the same rule with respect to the eating something that is tameh applies only with respect to the prohibition is only with respect to kadshe mizbeach, things that are sanctified to go on the altar. So yatsu kadshe bedek habayit. So that excludes things that are, if we were to donate something for the Beis Hamikdash's care. So there are two ways that you can donate something to the Beit HaMikdash. You can make something hektish as a sacrifice, or you can make it hektish in the concept of saying that the money of its value is going to go to support the needs of the Beit HaMikdash. And if you only did the latter and you did not do the former, so the item is only consecrated for the temple repair, well, then that does not apply. Eating that item, while you have certainly done something wrong, that eating that item is not subject to the prohibition of kares associated with the eating a shlamim or other kodshim that when you are tameh. And so that is so now hachinami. Now we're going to apply the reasoning that we just said to our case of yibum and arayas. Right? So the brother's wife is one of an entire category of arayot. The lama yatzasa, why was it singled out? Lahakisha laha, in order to compare it to all the other arayos. Below marlacha, and to tell you, ma eshes ach sharia, just as we allow the brother's wife who is ordinarily prohibited to you to marry you in connection with yibum, af kol arayos nami sharayan, maybe all other arayos are also lifted. So namely a wife's sister, your daughter, etc., they would all be lifted. So Gemara, of course, now challenges this because it certainly doesn't make any sense. Midachi, 1 second, these cases are not comparable. Midami, excuse me. Are these cases comparable? They're not comparable at all. Hasam klal be'isser uprat be'isser. When it came to the case of shlamim, we had a general prohibition, namely, don't eat something kodesh when you're tameh, and then we said don't eat shlamim when you're tameh. So we made a specific item out of the general category, but they were both prohibitions. We said don't eat kodshim when you're tameh, and now we say a specific of those, don't eat shlamim when you're tameh. So as a result, we can learn from the reference to shlamim back to the entire category. But what did we do here? Here we have an exception to the rule, not just a specific example of the rule. We have an exception. So hasam klal be'isser ufrat be'isser. There, the general category is a prohibition, and the specific category is a prohibition. Hacha klal be'isser. The general category is a prohibition, namely not having relations with any of the prohibited arayot. But when it came to the prat beheter, we were specifically singling out the ability to marry somebody that would be prohibited, that would ordinarily be prohibited, and now we're saying it's specifically permitted. So, hello, dummy. That's a different principle of the Rabbi Yishmael's principles that we learn every morning. That's the principle of when you learn out something new for it. And in that situation, you can't go back and learn anything to the general category until the Torah itself takes you back to the general category. And now we're going to give the paradigmatic example of a davar shahaya b'chlal v'yatzel ledun b'davar chadash she'iyat hayachol lachziro ad she'achazirena l'chal kasub b'ferish. A paradigmatic example of that category of learning something new with respect to something, and then saying we won't apply it to the general category until we're brought back to talking about the general category. So what is that? Tanya, we have a brisa. Davar shahaya bichlal v'yatza l'dum b'davar chadash iyatay rashai lachziro l'chlalo ad shiachzirena l'kah hakazub b'ferish. That when you have something that was part of a larger category and you learn something new with respect to that specific item, then we do not apply the new rule to the entire category until the item is put back into that general category. And so what's the example? Ketzad, v'shachat es hakeves b'makom asher yishchad es hachatas v'es ha'olah b'makom hakadosh. That we slaughter this. We're talking about an animal that is being a mitzora. Somebody who has tsaras, he is going through the purification process, and as part of the purification process, he has to offer an asham, and we offer that asham in the same place where we would slaughter the chatas and the ola, namely in the northern side of the altar. Okay, ki chatas ha'asham hula kohen, because this asham is going to be like a chatas for the kohen. She'ein talmud lomer kachatas ha'asham. We didn't need, the Torah did not need to tell us that the asham is like the chatas. Umal talmud lomer kachatas ha'asham lefishi yatsa asham mitzora lidum b'davar chadash, because the asham of the mitzora has specific rules that are different from every other category of sin offering. Why? The kohen yad, bivohen yad, uvohen regel hayamanit. You need to place blood on the right thumb and the right big toe of the mitzora. Okay, so yachal lo yehei ta'on matan damim ve'emurim legabe mizbeach. So now again we have the principle that this asham of a mitzora is part of a larger category of asham, chatas, and ola. And then we say that this asham of a mitzora, you have to put blood on the person's thumb and big toe. And so I might have thought that as a result of that, that's the only blood application that we need. And that it doesn't need also blood application on the altar. And so now we turn to Zayin Amabet, Talmud Lomar, ki kachatas ha'ashamhu, that for the asham is like a chatas, so we get put back into the category. And so as a result, ma chatas te'una matan damim ve'imurim legabi mizbeach, af asham ta'un matan damim ve'imurim legabi mizbeach. So as a result, because we have essentially a placement of this asham mitzora back into the category of a chatas, so as a result, not only do you put blood on the person's thumb and on the person's big toe, but you're also going to put blood on the altar itself. And so now let's apply this logical reason to the concept of yibum and the prohibitions of arayot. So ve'ilo ahadare kra, and if the Torah had not put it back into the category of chatas and of a chatas offering, hava amina, I would have thought l'bayda nafik. Once you singled it out, once you put this asham category as something where you put the blood on the person's big toe and thumb, so l'mayda nafik, l'mayda lo nafik. It's going to be singled out for one thing, but it's not going to be singled out in part of the category generally. So hachaname hava amina, I would have thought eishes ach de ishtara. Who is it that the Torah permits as a result of yibum? It's specifically the brother's wife. Shara rayas lo ishtara. So, but everybody else's wife, lo. It's they were not lifted. Yes. Okay. So as a result, so now we're back to our problem. We still have no source or no reason to specifically think that we need this aleha gzeira shava that we learned back on Daf Gimel Amabet. Why would you even think to say that the arayos would go away, that we need to have a specific zereshava to teach us that the arayos still apply even in the context of yibum. So Ella salka daita chamina teise b'mamatzinu me'eshes ach. We're going to learn it from a mamatzinu from eshes ach. Mamatzinu is literally means what do we find? Meaning what characteristics do we find by X? If we see those characteristics elsewhere, we'll apply the same rule. Okay. Now it's very easy to undermine a mamatzinu because as long as you find any characteristics that don't match, so then you've undermined it. And so we're going to quickly undermine it, but then we're going to try and boost it up again. So Ella salka daita chamina, I might have thought tesi b'mamatzinu me'eshes ach. Let's learn the fact that you can have that maybe you could do yibum by other arayot, from the fact that you could do yibum when it comes to a brother's wife, ma eshes ach miyabma, just as you can do yibum by eshes ach, by the brother's wife, avachos isha yabim. So too, your wife's sister, if she's the one who falls to you through your brother's passing, so then you're allowed to do yibum to her as well, notwithstanding the fact that the Torah has that as a separate category of arayot. So midami, 1 second, these categories are completely different. Hasam chadisura. When it comes to the ordinary brother's wife, you only have one prohibition that's associated with it, namely, it's the brother's wife. Hacha treisuri. But here, in the case of a wife's sister, you have both the fact that she is your wife's sister, and you have the fact that it was your brother's wife. So that those are two prohibitions. So how can you say that those are comparable cases? That's not a mamatzinu. So no, we could still make this mamatzinu. How? What would I have thought? You might have said, hoel the ishtri. Just once we allowed it, we should allow it in general. Umana tamra de amrin and hoel the ishtri. And how do I know that we have this principle of once we allow something, maybe we'll allow it in other cases as well? So we have it in a case of a mitzorah. So let me give you that case outside, and then that will help us go through and understand the case inside. So we have a mitzorah on the 8th day. So after 7 days of the purification process, he needs to bring a korban on the 8th day. He's referred to on that 8th day as a mechusar kapara, right? So he just needs to bring an offering, and as soon as he brings the offering, so he's going to be tahor. And we're going to say that this 8th day is Erev Pesach. And so that night, he wants to be able to eat the Korban Pesach. And that's really important. But unfortunately, that night, the night before the 8th, he saw a seminal discharge. Now, the problem is that somebody who sees a seminal discharge is not allowed in the location of the Beit HaMikdash where the Mitzorah needs to go in order to go through the end of his process. And the only time that somebody who's a Baal Keri who sees a seminal discharge is allowed back into the Beit HaMikdash is after nightfall. Well, that's too late. That's going to be too late. He's not going to be able to have the Korban Pesach. So, but we're going to see that even though the person had a seminal discharge, we're going to allow him into the Beit HaMikdash in order to have the blood put on him. And why are we going to allow him to do that? We are going to allow him to do that because the fact is that even a Mitzorah is not allowed to be in the place where he needs to be in order to put the blood on him. He ends up he's at the gate of the courtyard, but he has to stick his hand into the courtyard, and so as a result, he also is not allowed to be where he's supposed to be, where he needs to be in order to go through the process of purification. And so, since we're allowing the Mitzorah to be there, we're also going to allow even a more difficult case of a Baal Keri to be there. And so that's what we're going to say, and that's going to show us that once we lift the prohibition, maybe we lift the category generally. So Umana, so Detanya, because so let's now do the proof inside. Mitzorah shechal shmini shelo be'erev Pesach. We have a mitzorah whose 8th day of purification is going to be erev Pesach. The ra karibo bayom, and yet he sees a seminal discharge that day, and so now he's not allowed to go to that location in the Beit HaMikdash in order to become tahor v'tavel. But and so and he goes, so he's going to be tovel, and so amru chachavim aval pi she'ein tvul yom acher nichnas, even though generally a tvul yom is somebody who goes to the mikvah who will become tahor at night, but yet is not fully tahor at the moment. So he's not allowed to go into the Beit HaMikdash, into the inner courtyard where the altar is located. So Zen nichnas, but we're going to allow him to go in. So again, this all is going to happen at the what is called a Shar Nikanor. That's where he's supposed to go. And so, and why do we allow him? Mutav shiavo ase sheyesh bo kares v'yidcha ase she'ein bo kares. So we'll have an ase. We have 2 ases that are here. We want him to be able to offer the Pesach offering, and the problem is that the Pesach offering is if you don't make the Pesach offering, you are chayav kares. So the yidcha ase she'ein bo kares, and so we're going to override the ase that doesn't have kares, namely the penalty of a tvul yom going into the Beit HaMikdash. Rabbi Yochanan dabar Torah afilu ase leisvei. Actually, Rabbi Yochanan says that really there isn't even a biblical prohibition here. Why? Shenemar vayamod Yehoshaphat b'kal Yehuda lifnei hachatzer hachadasha. That Yehoshaphat stood among the congregation in front of a new courtyard. But one second, the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash wasn't new. Why machatzer hachadasha? How was there a new courtyard? So Amar Rebbe, the Gemara, the Masoros Hashas takes out Rabbi Yochanan and says and suggests that this is Amar Rebbe, that he's quoting Rebbe, a Tana. Shechidshu ba dvarim va'amru, because Yehoshaphat initiated a new law that said tvul yom lo yikanes l'machaneh leviyah, that a tvul yom can't go into the Levite camp. So va'amar ula matam. So what's the reason that we're going to allow this all to happen? And since it was permitted for someone with saras to go into this location, even though, as Rashi says, bia b'mikzah shma bia, that going into that location is considered entering the Beit HaMikdash, and a mitzara is not allowed to go into that location. Puter l'kruyo, we're going to also allow it for somebody who has a seminal discharge. So what have we shown? What we've shown is, and this is where we'll stop, what we've shown is the fact that we've explained that there's this concept of once we allow something, we'll allow the category generally. And so what we'll say is, once we allow a yibum with respect to a brother's wife, and a brother's wife is one of the forms of arayot that you're not allowed to ordinarily marry, will allow yibum with respect to all the other categories of arayot. And so as a result, or at least the 15 other categories that we mentioned in our Mishnah. But because we have the Gzera Shava of Aleha, that tells us that the 15 categories in our Mishnah are in fact prohibited. So now we've explained why we need the Gzera Shava of Aleha. Without that Gzera Shava, I might have thought that you could do Yibum with your daughter. You could do Yibum with your wife's sister. You could do Yibum with all those other categories that we had in our first Mishnah. And so it's only because we have the Aleha Gzera Shava that we don't have to do it. So things are looking good at this moment. Okay? But stay tuned tomorrow. Yes. Same bad time, same bad channel, as we will find that once again there are problems with this argument, and the argument that other arayot should be permitted based on this concept. And so instead, we're going to revisit the Aleha Gzera Shava itself, and we're going to say that actually maybe it's teaching us something completely different. And so while we had been thinking all along that we needed to show that in fact there was some reason that you might say that will allow arayot in connection with Yibum. No, in fact, we never would have ever allowed arayot with respect to Yibum, but we're going to say that maybe in certain narrow cases, you might have allowed it. And we'll try to put the Gzeira Shava for those narrower cases. So stay tuned tomorrow as we continue this ride on this this basic concept, this question, this fundamental question of why do we announce the Gzeira Shava, but then it's like, why do we need it? And so we're still working on why do we need it. And at the moment, at least, we have a good reason. We need it in order to tell us that we don't say that once we allow one araya, we're going to allow all the arayas. And so stay tuned tomorrow as we continue this ride.
Thank you. See you
Hey,
guys
thanks,
tomorrow.
David.
Bye-bye.